This is a demonstration of how to use the thick paint compatible foliage brush pack I created for Corel Painter. I'm going to start by filling my canvas with a sky color. You can feel free to hunt around for the exact color that you want. Let's go with something like this. And I'll just use an airbrush with a lighter yellow color to put in a sky like this. Because these are thick paint compatible brushes, I'll want to be painting on thick paint layers. This will allow me to control the paint thickness dynamically. We'll go ahead and name this layer Field. And the first brush that we'll take a look at is called Fieldy. I'll select a grass color. Might make it a bit lighter. And I'm going to hold Shift and just paint straight across the horizon here. If I use lighter pressure with this brush, then I'm going to get a little bit of the dab stencil. You can see that here. I can change the dab stencil from my flow map panel. And here you can change that texture you get. So for example, I could select clouds, and I get a cloudy texture when I use light pressure. Or I could select high contrast clouds, and now I get something that looks a little bit more horizontal. If I use heavy pressure, then I'm going to get these grass blades that fan out, and with lighter pressure, I'm going to get something that's just a little bit more speckly and flatter. There is some color variability in this stroke, which you have control over. You can find the controls for that in the color variability panel. I'll go ahead and just fill this in. And if I increase my brush size, let's say to 50, then those grass blades are going to be bigger, and I can cover more area. You'll want to do this as you move into the foreground to give a sense of perspective. I'll set it to 75. You don't want to go too large with this brush because it will start to become really slow, and the grass blades will start to look more like little speckles. I'll set the size back to 25. Let's choose a darker shadow color, and we'll turn on Preserve Transparency for this layer. We'll do a test stroke here, and I'll use lighter pressure, and I can blend the colors together like so. If I use heavier pressure, I'll create an opaque stroke, and I can use lighter pressure to blend that in. So I could create various planes like so. I'll go ahead and just fill this in with the original color. I'm going to turn off Preserve Transparency, and I'll create a new thick paint layer. I'll name this layer Grassy, and let's select the Grassy brush. I'm going to sample this green color that I used for my field and just make it a bit brighter, a little bit more yellow. And if I paint back and forth with this brush, you can see that I can build up these blades of grass. And depending on the direction that I point my pen, that's going to control the direction that these grass blades flow out. So as you can see now, they're going horizontally, but if I keep my pen upright like this, pointed upward, they're going to flow out vertically. And I can get every angle in between. So I want to use this a little bit here in the foreground. Just put in some grass blades. I'll go over this a few times. Making your brush larger will make those grass blades taller, but it's also going to make your brush a lot slower. And of course, making your brush smaller will make the grass blades shorter, or if you're painting them in the distance, then they'll just look farther away. And of course, your brush will work faster. So I can really easily put in all this detail in the background here without a whole lot of work. If I wanted to, I could even select a darker color and put in some grass blades in the foreground here. That way there's a variety of different colors. This brush is using color variability, so again, you can turn that on and off if you like. I want to make sure to scale my brush, try to keep the direction that the blades are flowing the same as what I already put down. But it's okay if they intersect each other a bit, that'll help it look natural. I'm really just being kind of free when I'm putting this in. If something doesn't look right, I can always do an undo, but I'm just being spontaneous. We could even have some areas that are a darker brown color like this. These could be areas of dead grass. And I can use some of that stuff that appeared when I put down that base grass color earlier. Now that I have this really nice field of grass, I'm going to add a layer beneath it. A thick paint layer, of course. And I'll just call this Distant Trees. We're going to use a variety of brushes to put this stuff in. I'll select Bunchy. This brush uses your main and your additional color. I'm going to sample the sky color. Then I'll sample one of these green colors from the grass. Now if I paint a stroke across the sky, you can see it has a mixture of both colors. I'll just be pretty spontaneous here and just put in some different tree shapes. Not thinking too much about what I'm doing, I'm just kind of putting it in. These are trees that are very distant. Just to show you what else this brush can do, I'll select a darker green color and I'll paint here. I can use lighter pressure to get smaller, finer leaves and more of this texture coming from my dab stencil. which I can of course change to something else, like let's say clouds. Now I get a different texture. I can blend other colors into this, and I can increase the visible depth if I want those leaves to look thicker. I'll reduce the visible depth to a lower value because I want those trees to look distant. And I can even go into the field layer here and add some depth if I like. You can do that on the grassy layer as well. But try to only add depth if you really need to. Just because you can use these brushes with paint thickness doesn't necessarily mean you should. I'll create a new layer above the distant trees, and I'll name it Trunks Far. I'll select the Branchy brush, and I'll select a black color so I can demonstrate with this brush. I want to make sure I switch that to my main color and select my main color. This brush can do a few different things. You can make distant tree trunks like so, or you can use firmer pressure and taper it off to create tree branches. If I select a brownish color like this and paint a stroke, I can add some visible depth to it to add some shadows and highlights and make it look three-dimensional. You'll notice if I use lighter pressure, I get more of this broken effect. That'll help the tree trunks to look like they're getting covered up a little bit by some of the leaves. I'll sample one of these light blue colors near the horizon, and I'll just put in some distant tree trunks here. Be careful not to make them too thick, since they're supposed to be far away. If you want, you can reduce the size of your brush to keep it from becoming too wide. We'll come back to this brush later and use it for some foreground branches. I'll create another thick paint layer. Let's select the Bushy brush, which is just a blender. We'll need to already have paint on the canvas that we can blend. On this distant trees layer, I'll just blend that a little bit. And you can see that it breaks up the edges, helps it look kind of a little bit more distant, but it also pushes around the paint thickness, which makes it look a bit sharper. So you have some control over that sharpness, but you probably don't want it to be too sharp. I don't necessarily need to do this on the background trees, but you could do this to blend together different colors to make it look more bushy or like foliage. I'll create a new layer above the Trunks Far layer. I'll name this Evergreeny, and let's select the Evergreeny brush. I'm going to sample my distant tree color. I'm going to make it darker, maybe shift it a bit more toward blue, and we'll have a distant evergreen. Now when I pull down with this brush, I get a directional stroke, and I can make that stroke go in any direction and even curve. So I could pull down like this and have some needles that go up, or pull down like this and have branches that go down. I can get all sorts of really interesting evergreen shapes. I could even do kind of a zigzag like this. I'm going to put in an evergreen tree here off to the side. I'm just going to pull down with it to create these evergreen branches. I can even pull up a few bushes here on the ground next to it. Put in some of that stuff over here as well. I'm going to lighten my color a bit. Let's go ahead and go back to Branchy, and let's add some trunks to these foreground trees as well. I'll create another new layer. Let's move this above the field and grass. I'll name this Flowery, and I'll select the Flowery brush. I'll select a light pink color, and I'll paint a test stroke. And you can see that I get these really nice flower effects. There's a little bit of color variability, and if I use lighter pressure, those flowers are smaller. If I use heavier pressure, then they get bigger. So I might want to just desaturate my pink color like this a bit so it's not too pink. And put some flowers here in the distance with lighter pressure, and then just have them get bigger as they move into the foreground. Let's put in some white flowers that have a little bit of that sky color. And we can try adding some thickness to those to see if it helps. Let's go to the Evergreeny layer too and add some thickness to that. As you can see, I can add some thickness, but I probably don't want to in this case since I want this to look distant. A tiny bit might be okay. Let's create another new layer. We'll have it be below the field but above the evergreen. Call this Foliagy. We'll select that brush. Now I'll select kind of a dark greenish color like this, and just put in a test stroke. You can see that I get some dab stencil, which right now is set to clouds, but I could set that to something else like marbled. Then I get a different pattern. Or gravel if I want something that's finer. I can select a lighter color like this bright yellow and paint into that to blend these colors together and create nice mixtures of yellow and green. So let's put in a darker color for some foliage. I'll select the clouds flow map, and I'll have some leaves kind of hanging over into the scene. And I'll select a lighter green that's a bit more yellow and put in some leaves on top of that. Now because we're using these thick paint brushes, our paint thickness has a sense of lighting on it. We can change that by going to Canvas Surface Lighting. And if I wanted to, I could move it to the other side of the composition, but I'll just leave it where it's at in the top left. But we want to keep that in mind when we're shading. We want to keep our lighting in the top left as well. Now these leaves look a little odd without any branches to connect them. So let's create a layer beneath that. We'll call that Branchy. Let's select the Branchy brush, get a brownish color, add some thickness to it. And I'll have some tree branches that kind of connect some of these leaves. Let's create another thick paint layer. I'm going to call this Trunks Mid. I'll add some visible depth. And let's use this to put in some tree trunks here in the foreground. I'll create another new layer. I'll call it Fractally, and let's select the Fractally brush. I'm going to get kind of a dark bluish green color like this. And if I do a test stroke with this brush and use light pressure, I'm going to get very small, thin fractals. But if I press harder, I'm going to get thicker fractals. And this fractal shape is based upon the flow map that I have selected. So if I select fish skin, for example, I'll get something that's more hexagonal. Or if I select high contrast clouds, I'll get something that's more horizontal. If I want something that's a little bit more speckly, I could even choose gravel. Well, let's choose something that's flat, like high contrast clouds. I'm going to use lighter pressure and just kind of paint side to side here and just let the brush do the work. Fill in these trees here as one big group. I'll have these ones over here. And if you want that pattern to be smaller, you can reduce the scale, or you could increase it if you want it to be larger. It's good to have a variety of scale, that way it doesn't look too repetitive. I'm not happy with this tree up in the corner, so I'm actually just going to erase this and paint it in again later at another point. I'll hide those branches as well. We'll go back to that Fractally layer, convert that to a thick paint layer. And with Fractally, I'm going to add some visible depth and just paint over those to give these some thickness. You can select kind of a light yellow green and paint into that as well. I'll need to add some trunks that are showing through here. So I'll use Branchy just to kind of have some peek through like so. I'll have a few branches kind of come off of them as well. And I can add a tiny bit of visible depth just to make those stand out. I'll name that layer Trunks Foreground. I'm going to show this Branchy layer that I hid earlier. And another way you can kind of set things back into the distance is to select something like an airbrush, such as the digital airbrush. I'll go to this Distant Trees layer, or right click on it. I'll turn on Preserve Transparency. I'll sample one of these lighter blue colors from the horizon. I'll just paint right along the bottom. That separates those planes visually. Do that for the Evergreeny layers as well, and for the Fractally layers, but only where it needs it, so just maybe where it's a bit too dark in some places. If I check my value, I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to group Trunks Foreground, Fractally, and Trunks Mid. Call this Trees Mid. That way I can deal with that as one group. I'm going to hide that for a minute so that I can concentrate on these branches up here. Above that layer, let's add a layer for Leafy. We'll select the Leafy brush. This brush uses your main and additional color, so I'll select two different colors, kind of a yellow-green highlight color, and then a darker shadow color. And again, I want to check my values to make sure that those dark values match up with the dark values in my branches. If I create a demonstration stroke with this brush, I want to make kind of a C shape, but it could go any direction like so. The faster you do it, the better it's going to look. You can make really big, broad leaves like this, or really small, fine ones that are shorter. You could do angular leaves. You can do stems with leaves. It's a very interesting brush. Once you add a leaf, you can also control the thickness of it. So I can add some highlights and shadows to it like this. Let's add a little bit of visible depth. Put some leaves here on this tree. You may even want to create another layer beneath that and just make your color a bit darker so that you can have some leaves that are on the interior of the tree. As you can see, I'm just being really spontaneous about this, but still thinking about the different clumps that are there and trying to make sure to attach these to the branches, and could even have a nice bright one here and there that really stand out. Let's bring back those tree mid layers. Let's go ahead and group those foreground trees. We'll name this Tree Right. While we're at it, we may as well just group these layers for the field. Let's check out what some of the other brushes can do. I'll create a thick paint layer, call it Trunk Foreground. Let's use the Branchy brush for this. Let's have a really big trunk coming up like this. And we'll have some branches that hang down off of it. If you want the trunk to look more textured, you can turn on Preserve Transparency and then just paint over it to add some various cracks and crevices to it. This is something you should probably do before you put the branches on. I'll create a new layer, turn off Preserve Transparency. Let's call this Needly. I'll select a dark blue-green color and the Needly brush. And as you can see, I can put in some really nice pine needle patterns. Lighter pressure gives you smaller, finer needles. Heavier pressure gives you bigger, thicker needles. I'll turn on Preserve Transparency, make that color a bit lighter. And then here and there, I can put some highlights over those. But most of them can be in shadow since we're kind of behind the tree here. Go a bit brighter, a bit more toward yellow. I'll select a dark blue-gray color and we'll put some reflections on some of these as well. We can add some visible depth, which helps them look a little bit more needly. And I might reduce the visible depth of the trunk. I'm going to group those layers and then play with the position of them. Might make this tree look a bit taller by raising it up. I'll name that layer Pine. I'm going to zoom into this tree trunk now. In that pine group, I'm going to create a layer above the trunk foreground. I'll call this Mossy. Let's select the Mossy brush. I'm going to right click on the trunk foreground layer, select layer content, go back to the Mossy layer, hide the selection with Ctrl-Shift-H, and select kind of a mossy color to put on the tree. And of course I can play with the visible depth to control that thickness. Something like that looks kind of nice. Let's select the next brush, which is Planty. I'm going to create a layer for Planty. Similar to Leafy, I can create leaf shapes, but these are shaped and behave a little bit differently. But like before, I will want to select a lighter color and then a darker color for the shadow. I'll need to Ctrl-D to deselect my active selection, and I can paint a leaf here just to see how it looks. As you can see, you do that kind of curved shape. These ones are a little bit more dynamic. You can get a lot more movement out of this brush. I'm going to do a stem that comes up over here. I'll do some leaves that come off of that. This works really well to create a lot of different plant details. Now I can add some visible depth to make it look thicker. And in order to help it stand out from the background, I'm going to go to Effects, Tonal Control, Adjust Colors. I might shift the hue a little bit and make it a bit darker. I might also go to that Leafy layer and reduce the visible depth of that so it's not so thick. There's only a couple more brushes left. The next is Shruby. I'll create a new layer for that. I'll select one of these darker colors here from the pine needles. This brush has directional features that follow the stroke of your brush. So you could do something like this to create really nice bushy patterns. If I wanted to, I could even just take that, move it down here into the corner. Let's add to that a bit more. I can select another color, maybe like a lavender color, and put in some highlights on top of that. Let's add another layer, and let's use Flowery to put a few flowers on top of that as well. Add a little visible depth, add some to the Shruby layer as well. Might be good to add in some Branchy. We'll do that on a new layer. Let's name these layers so that we know what they are. I'll group them together. I'm going to create a new layer beneath the field, call it Smashy, and we'll take a look at the last brush, which is called Smashy. Now, if you've ever seen the technique where you take a really big bristle brush and you smash it on the canvas to create foliage effects, this is the digital equivalent of that. So I want to get one of these darker background colors, make it a bit darker so that it fits in. I'll just do a test stroke here and see how it fits in contrast-wise. Might make it a bit darker. And the technique for this brush is just to kind of tap or dab, or you could build it up like so using circular strokes. You can make your brush bigger and get a bigger, broader dab, or smaller to get a smaller, finer dab. I'm going to just smash in a nice tree here. We'll make sure that it comes in front of that other tree. Turn on Preserve Transparency. Select a kind of yellowish green color, and we'll smash in some highlights on that tree as well. And select kind of a middle color here and put in some of that. Could even have some orangey colors to look like dead leaves. And of course we can increase the visible depth if we want the leaves to look thicker. I'm going to go ahead and just move that above the field. And beneath the Smashy layer, I'll just call this Smashy Trunk. I'll turn off Preserve Transparency. I'll select Branchy. Select this dark color that I'm already using here. And just give it a nice tree trunk that goes into the grass. I have some little branches that come up here and connect to some of those leaves. Next thing I want to do is create a new layer beneath the Smashy trunk. I'll call it Smashy Shadow. I'm going to go back to the Grassy brush. I'll sample this darker color. And here I'm going to want to put in some shadow from the tree onto the grass. I can play with the visible depth and the opacity just to get it to blend in right. If I wanted to, I could put in some other little shadows here that are cast from trees that maybe you just can't see. I have a few darker grass blades here in the foreground as well. We could even create another new layer. Let's just group these smashy layers together. I'll create that above the shadow. Let's call it HL for highlight. I don't want to spend too much time on my names here. I'm going to select a really bright yellow color. And here and there we can put out a few areas that really pop out. These are really catching the sunlight. I'm going to go to that smashy layer, which is this layer here. I'm going to select Bushy, which is that blender. I'm just going to blend that a bit and play with the visible depth until I get something I like. I might even use that on the Fractally layer. I'm going to go to this trees mid group to the trunks mid layer. I'm going to turn on preserve transparency. I'm going to select my digital airbrush. I'm going to sample that darker shadow color there and just darken some of those tree trunks where they're being overlapped by the foliage. Now I could even go in and begin to merge some of these layers. For example, I can merge the field down into a single layer. I'll also go ahead and include those smashy highlights and shadows into that layer. With preserve transparency on, I'm going to select a really bright yellow green. Keep using that digital airbrush. And here I can brighten it up, kind of have the light spilling in from the side there. Or I could select a darker bluish color and create kind of a vignette down on the bottom. And go to that canvas layer, which is the sky. We'll just have that get a bit darker up at the top as well. Maybe down near the horizon, we'll just make that sparkle a bit more. I'm going to go back to the shrubby group, go back to that flowers layer. Might add some brighter flowers here on the side that's catching the light. I'm going to go back to the background here and just clean up one of these trunks that's a bit too thick. And I think with that, we have a finished demonstration painting. If you're interested in these thick paint compatible foliage brushes for Corel Painter, you can download them from my website at aaronrutten.com.